and gentlemen, we hope that you're doing well today. We are here to go over the goals and actions section of the 2025-26 Local Control and Accountability Plan, or LCAP. This is another one in our series of webinars relating to the 2025-26 LCAP. We have 4 left scheduled for this series. Next week, we'll be looking at increased or improved services, part 1 and part 2. It's a meaty subject, and so we break it into 2 pieces. It saves everybody from an hour and a half long or more webinar, and breaks up kind of some dense subject matter. So we'll be doing that to close out the webinars for December, and then we'll pick it back up again in January to go over the equity multiplier focus goal and the learning, recovery, and emergency block grant actions and descriptions. As usual, we have the template files here that are available as part of the PowerPoint. They're also available on the LCAP web page on CDE's website. The purpose of today's webinar is to discuss the goals and actions section and the associated requirements with that, and then to review some important information about the goal development. We're going to touch on some topics in this webinar that we're not going to really go in depth in, specifically equity multiplier goals, specifics related to learning, recovery, and emergency block grant, or LREBG actions, and then the requirement to increase or improve services. As we just discussed, those are going to be talked about as part of upcoming webinars. We'll touch on them a little bit here, but aren't going to go into specifics. The intended audience for this webinar is pretty much anybody that's going to be working with the LCAP, because the goals and actions section of the LCAP is the meatiest section of the LCAP. In terms of foundational information, if we go back and we remember our foundational principles of the local control funding formula, that first and foremost, this is based on multiple measures of success. So we're looking at a variety of metrics. We're looking at both state and local data, and that's communicated both within the LCAP and within the California School Dashboard. We're looking at equity in terms of those actions that are intended to increase or improve services for low-income English learner and foster youth students, but also in terms of student groups that are lowest performing on the California School Dashboard, or that have been identified as an area of need or an area of focus within a LEA. And then, of course, subsidiarity, the idea that the local decisions are best handled at the local level. That obviously comes into play here, looking at the goals and actions and how those goals and actions are set up within the plan in order to enable the LEA to improve outcomes for students and provide them with the resources and support that they need in order to be successful. In terms of the LCAP, remember that the LCAP serves 3 distinct but related functions. The function of meaningful educational partner engagement, that shows up in a variety of ways. One of the ways that that shows up is within the goals and actions section, both in terms of the outcomes that are reported there, but also in terms of the action descriptions. And the way that those are described can go a long way in order to helping educational partners engage with the plan. Then comprehensive strategic planning, and looking at how our goals and actions are seeking to address those needs of students within the LEA, and focus the efforts of that planning so that it makes sense not only at the LEA level, but also at the school level. And then accountability and compliance. How is it that that we're fulfilling the obligations that we have in terms of legal responsibilities, such as the requirements to increase or improve services for low-income English learner and foster youth students. And we'll touch on these various elements of these as we go throughout the section. Getting into the template for the goals, there haven't been any changes to this section within the LCAP template. There have been some changes within the instructions. We'll touch on those. But essentially what we have here in terms of the components of the goal section is the goal number, the description, the type of goal that it is, the state priorities that are being addressed by the goal, the explanation of why the LEA has developed the goal, measuring and reporting results, the goal analysis, and then the action description itself. The reason that the goal analysis is placed where it is because it makes, when we were doing the redesign of the template, there was a lot of feedback from folks in the field that said that it made a lot of sense to have the measure and reporting results precede the goal analysis, because the data that showed up in the measure and reporting results really fed into the goal analysis, and then that goal analysis then drove the action descriptions. And so that's the reason that the goal analysis is found ahead of the actions. In terms of the visual look of the template, this is the way that the first part of the template looks. We've got the goal description. This is where the LEA provides its description of what it is that it's trying to achieve based on this goal. In terms of the type of goals, there are 4 types of goals identified within the LCAP. The LEA is going to identify which of those 4 types of goals are this particular goal is, and then identify the state priorities that are addressed by this goal, and then the explanation of why the LEA has developed the goal. Sometimes that explanation of why the LEA has developed the goal is going to be based around a particular theme, maybe ELA and mathematics performance. It might be due to the performance of particular student groups that the LEA wants to focus on, and that might be the reason why it's developed the goal. In the instance of an equity multiplier goal, it's because the LEA is required to develop that goal and include that within the plan. And so there's a variety of reasons why the LEA might develop a goal. That thing gets described there. Then we get into the measure and reporting results. Again, this is where we're going to outline our metrics, identify what the baseline for those metrics is. That was done as part of the 24-25 LCAP. This year, we'll be reporting out to year 1 outcomes, comparing those to the baseline, identifying what the current difference from baseline is, and then identify, and then that can be compared to the target for year 3 outcome as well, so that it's clear to folks that are looking at the plan what sort of progress has been made relative to each of those metrics. Then we get into the goal analysis. Again, for the goal analysis, we're not going to go into this in depth because the goal analysis was something that we spent an entire webinar on. If you're interested in more information on this, you can refer back to that goal analysis webinar that we did earlier in the series. Then we get into the actions themselves, where you're providing that short title for the action. That short title then shows up in the action tables that we'll talk about later on in this webinar. And then also the description of the action, where there's actually that description of what the action is expected to do, and how that, there's also additional information that LEAs can include there. You can include as part of that description how the LEA is increasing or improving services if they want. They could also provide the rationale for why a particular action is included in the plan relative to the LRABG requirements. Then we're identifying the total funds. That's the total amount of funds identified with this particular action, and then whether or not it's contributing towards meeting the requirement to increase or improve services for low-income English learner and foster youth students. Now let's talk about the types of goals. There's 4 types of goals, as I mentioned. Most LEAs have 2 or 3 types of goals. Let's walk through them here. The first goal that we'll talk about is the focus goal. The focus goal is it's concentrated in scope. It's looking at specifics around a particular issue or a particular student group. It could be a particular theme or topic, such as chronic absenteeism, and really focused in on looking at how to address that particular idea within a certain amount of time. That could be within 1 year, it could be within 2 years. It definitely is intended to be fully addressed by the end of the 3-year cycle. A focus goal isn't something that is intended to be drawn out over a long period of time. It's also not something that's intended to be focused on all students. It's generally looking at specific student groups or specific indicators or measures of progress, and focusing on how it is we want to meet the needs that have been identified in a short amount of time. Really drilling into local data and looking at that more intently and probably more regularly than with the other goals. So it's looking at data over time within a particular school year, really focusing on whether or not we're seeing the progress that we want to see. The equity multiplier focus goal is a specific type of focus goal. So it basically addresses everything that a focus goal does. However, it's specifically focused on the student groups that are performing within the red at that particular school site that's generating equity multiplier funds. That might be one school site, that might be multiple school sites, but the idea is that the LEA is taking a focused look at the particular student groups that have been identified in the dashboard as that greatest area of need for those particular areas that are in the red. So, for example, if we've got African American and Hispanic students in the red at the Equity Multiplier School on the 2024 dashboard for suspension, we're going to focus our goal on those particular student groups and that particular indicator. We'll get into more details on that and what that looks like at our webinar on January 7th. And provide some additional information on that. Those of you that had an equity multiplier goal in your 24-25 LCAP, you might have seen some changes within various student groups and looking at how those changes might impact this goal. That way, and we'll talk about that a bit more in that particular webinar. The third type of goal is a broad goal. A broad goal is the majority of goals that we see within the LCAP tend to be broad goals. Broad goals are going to address a variety of priorities. They're going to address a variety of student groups, and their scope is going to be broader. And they're also probably going to be more long-range goals. Typically, the goals that we see about improving ELA and math performance tend to be broad goals because they're looking at making progress, but there's not actually a particular end to the goal that LEAs are really looking at or focusing on. Whereas within a focus goal, you have a particular end to the goal in mind to say, okay, this is the level we want to reach, and once we've reached this level, then we've met this goal and we're done. The broad goal generally tends to continue throughout the years. And then the fourth type of goal that we have there is the maintenance of progress goal. And the maintenance of progress goal is different than the other three types of goals that are there. Because the maintenance of progress goal is not focused on improving things. It's focused on maintaining things. The focus goal, the equity multiplier focus goal, the broad goal, they're all focused on making progress and moving things forward. Whereas the maintenance of progress goal is focused on ensuring that things that are already working are continuing to do that work and aren't dropping off and are being monitored, but they aren't looking at improving outcomes for students. And so in general, your maintenance of progress goal is going to cover things that you're implementing that are already in place, that don't need you don't have to focus on improving them. You just need to focus on sustaining them. Examples of maintenance of progress goals could be within priority one, in terms of the material sufficiency, or in terms of the facilities in good repair. It could be priority two in terms of implementation of state academic content and performance standards. It could be priority 7 in terms of access to broad course of study. It's kind of going to depend on the LEA. But the idea behind a maintenance of progress goal is that you could take those various aspects of those priorities that you're including, that you just want to maintain. Those are all within that one maintenance of progress goal. And that maintenance of progress goal has a relatively small number of metrics that are associated with it that are simply focused on ensuring that the work the work that's being done continues to be done on a regular, ongoing basis, and that things aren't slipping, but it's not focused on improving anything in those particular areas. And so that's how the maintenance of progress goal can be used by LEAs in order to address particular pieces that they don't need to improve within the plan, and that's why it's there. Let's look at the instructions there when we're talking about goals, because the instructions provide some additional information. The instructions for a focus goal is that the description is providing, the description of a focus goal is going to be specific, measurable, and time bound. which means that within that description of the goal, like what the goal is expected to achieve, it's going to say, we're going to do this specific thing for these specific students based on these specific measures of progress within this amount of time. It's really going to be explicit in what it is that it's seeking to achieve. The focus goal can explicitly reference metrics that will be measured as part of that description, and the time frame that the LEA expects to achieve that goal. So within 1 year, within 2 years, within 3 years, and that's called out as part of that goal description. In terms of the type of goal, it's identified as a focus goal. In terms of why the LEA has developed the goal, you're going to explain why the LEA has chosen to prioritize this particular goal within the plan. And that explanation needs to be based on data, obviously, whether that's state level data or local level data that's been collected. It could also be data that has been collected from educational partners. And then the LEA is going to describe how it identified that for focused attention, including the consultation, like how educational partners were engaged in that. Now, obviously, you don't have to specifically, describe all of the educational partner engagement that went into the development of that goal. That's done as part of the engaging educational partners section. But you can include that information in there if you want. Then LEAs are also encouraged to promote transparency and understanding around the decision to use a focus goal, because generally speaking, those focus goals are going to focus on specific groups of students or specific indicators. It's important for educational partners to know why it is that you've chosen to focus on just a small subset of students or a particular indicator when you're putting those focus goals in place. In terms of the equity multiplier focus goal, as I've already mentioned, this is a specific focus goal that is related to equity multiplier funding. In addition to what's required for a regular focus goal, there's specific requirements for the equity multiplier focus goal, such as you have to ensure that the student groups that are performing in the red on the 2024 dashboard at the school or schools that are generating equity multiplier funding are addressed within the goal. You could have one equity multiplier goal per site, or you could have a single equity multiplier goal that encapsulates multiple sites. That's kind of based on whether or not the lowest performance, those red indicators are the same, or the student groups are the same across multiple sites. Obviously, if one school is low in ELA and mathematics performance for its American Indian population, and another school has a red in the suspension rate indicator for its Hispanic students, combining the two of those isn't going to make a lot of sense from a programmatic standpoint. You might want to have separate goals for those two. But if there is some congruity between those two on the dashboard, then you can have a single goal that addresses multiple sites. In terms of instructions for a broad goal, the LEA is going to describe what it plans to achieve, and that what it plans to achieve is going to be aligned with the expected outcomes that are part of the goal. It's also going to align with the actions that are part of a goal. So it's not going to be just a bunch of random things that are all kind of thrown together. They're actually going to make sense with each other, and you're going to be able to see how the actions and the metrics that are included within a broad goal are supporting the LEA making progress towards that goal or achieving that goal. The description of the goal is going to be specific, to be measurable in terms in qualitative or quantitative terms, but it's not going to provide the level of specificity that is called for when you're doing a focus goal. And then the broad goal is also not going to be as specific as a focus goal. In terms of the type of goal, obviously it's identified as a broad goal. And in terms of the why statement, you're going to explain why the LEA developed the goal and how the actions and metrics grouped together help to achieve that goal. So there's the why statement for a broad goal requires a little bit different information than the why statement within a focus goal. And then lastly, for maintenance of progress goals, when we're looking at maintenance of progress goals, that description is going to describe how the LEA intends to maintain the progress that it's made in those LCFF priority areas that are not addressed by other goals. So again, kind of highlighting this is where this is the sort of goal where you might actually see unrelated priorities or pieces of unrelated priorities that show up together. They don't have to be grouped together in any particular way, because again, the focus of this maintenance of progress goal is really on maintaining what's going on, not on improving outcomes in a particular area. So when we're talking about the state priorities as part of this, they can be addressed in a variety of ways. Again, we want to make sure that our educational partners are a part of the discussion about something being in a maintenance of progress goal. Obviously, you know, if we're including parts of priorities in a maintenance of progress goal, we want our educational partners to understand why that's in there. If say graduation rate just shows up in a maintenance of progress goal, educational partners might be like, well, wait, why is graduation rate in there? We want to make sure that it's clear to folks why a particular priority or piece of a priority has shown up within a maintenance of progress goal. And then in terms of the why statement, explaining how the actions are going to sustain the progress that has been identified within the metrics that are included in the goal. So, how is it that those metrics then are showing that the progress is being maintained? In terms of utilizing different types of goals, there's benefits, there's pros and cons to each of the types of goals. But if you're utilizing different types of goals, it can really help the LEA to streamline and focus the LCAP in the areas that are of greatest need. You can really focus on those things that are of highest priority in terms of addressing. Obviously, just given the available resources, it's highly unlikely that any LEA out there is going to be able to address all of its areas of need within a given year or even within the 3-year LCAP cycle. That's why it's important that as part of the goal development process, LEAs are identifying here are the things that we really want to focus on for the next 3 years. And some of those things are going to be focused areas where we're really trying to solve a particular problem of practice within a shorter period of time, 1, 2, possibly 3 years. But at the end of that, we want to see that's taken care of, that problem is no longer there. On the other hand, a broad goal is going to be more of a long range sort of goal. It's going to be something that folks are continuing to work on. It's probably going to benefit all or most of the students within the LEA, and so utilizing those two different sorts of goals when we're talking about making progress are going to allow the LEA to be able to kind of have a couple of overarching goals, an area of focus, and then the remainder is could show up within a maintenance of progress goal, which would then basically, be monitored to ensure that it's not getting any worse, uh, but it's also not, actively working to improve outcomes during that 3 year period, and utilizing that in order to streamline the plan. Sometimes what we see within LCAPs are we see that there are so many goals that are part of the plan, um, that very little actually gets achieved with all of those goals. It's better to identify those things that are real areas, like immediate areas of need. Try to focus on those areas, get those addressed first, and then move on to other areas. And utilizing those different types of goals allows that to happen. Um, so let's talk about some important information to consider when we're developing a goal. Um, First of all, just some questions. What have we learned? What what's come about through our comprehensive needs analysis from educational partners? What are the current needs that have been identified through that information, and how are we best able to address them? And so we're gonna kind of focus on some of these things. When we're talking about requirements for goals, um, the LCAP has to include a description of the annual goals that are to be achieved for all state priorities and any local priorities that get identified by the LEA. Um, LEAs are everybody's required to address the state priorities. Um, LEAs can choose to identify local priorities and address those as part of the goals as well. And there's some LEAs out there that have specifically developed goals that relate to particular student populations within their LEA, and how they're going to focus on improving outcomes for those student groups based on those local priorities that have been identified. Um, then LEAs are to pay particular attention to addressing and reducing disparities in opportunities and outcomes between student groups that are indicated on the California School Dashboard. So, for example, at this point in time, a lot of LEAs, most if not all LEAs, have specific actions in their LCAP based on the 2023 dashboard, and student groups that were performing in the lowest performance level, in the red on the California 2023 California School Dashboard. When it comes to those particular actions, those are not required to be revised based on the 2024 dashboard, but an LEA can choose to include actions based on the 2024 dashboard in its LCAP if it chooses to. So, for example, one of the things that we've seen with the 2024 dashboard is that there's been a lot of low performing indicators when it comes to the long-term English learners student subgroup, which has been newly added to the dashboard. In those instances, an LEA might want to go back and look at, okay, what sort of actions do we need to include in the LCAP in order to address our low performing LTEL population. And we'll talk a little bit as we get down into the actions about how that can actually meet multiple requirements. And it's not just, looking at adding additional stuff for adding additional stuff's sake. It could potentially meet other requirements as well. So then, based on this, how are LEAs using their available resources in order to respond to the needs of students and to address those performance gaps, including increasing or improving services for foster youth, English learners, and low-income students? What's being done in order to ensure that this is occurring? As I've already mentioned, the LCAP has to address all of the LCFF priorities and their associated metrics that are applicable to the LEA. Now, what does it mean when it says as applicable to the LEA? If you look at those two sections of education code in 52060D and 52066D, you see after the various priorities, the statement as applicable. In general, that means if it's applicable to the LEA. So, for example, we've got metrics in there for graduation rate. Metrics for graduation rate obviously aren't going to apply to an elementary school district. If you're an elementary school district, you don't have to address that particular part of the priority because it doesn't apply to you. On the other hand, if you're a high school district, you have to address graduation rate because it applies to you. So that's generally what the as applicable means within each of those state priority areas. LEAs don't generally get to pick and choose whether or not they want to address a particular indicator. It's more whether or not the LEA provides services in that particular area. So, for example, a virtual charter school isn't going to discuss the whether or not it has facilities that have a rating of good as based on the FIT tool, right? You're just, it doesn't apply, and so you're not going to address that. When we're talking about these state priorities, the LCFF state priority summary that's linked here, it's on the CDE's LCAP webpage, kind of breaks down the various priorities. It identifies what we refer to as the state required metrics. Those are the measures of progress in priorities 4, 5, and 6 that LEAs have to address within their LCAPs. Those have to be measures of progress within the LCAP. So things like graduation rate, suspension rate, expulsion rates, ELA and mathematics and science for CASP and CAST, the LPAC performance, things like that are all going to be are all examples of state required metrics, and those have to be addressed by LEAs. The other piece that comes into this is that local data. We want folks to be using that local data. One of the things that we saw as kind of a that we saw during the pandemic when things shut down and standardized tests were suspended and there was no standardized test data. There were lots of LEAs that struggled to identify whether or not students were making progress in the following year because they relied on those standardized tests. Looking at local benchmark assessments, looking at other local measures of progress is turned out to be really critical in making sure that they were able to identify whether or not students were making progress in the following years. And I think it continues to be something that is important because, again, as we've mentioned in other webinars, the data that shows up on the dashboard is always, a year or two in arrears. And so it's not the most recent data. That local data provides that more recent context for LEAs and allows you guys to be able to make better decisions based on that local data in addition to the state level data. Goals can also address local priorities, as I've already mentioned, and you can have one goal that addresses multiple priorities. So let's talk about, we've talked about kind of the beginning, the introductory part of the goal with the descriptions and the type of goal and the why statement and what that needs to look like. Let's talk about measuring and reporting results. This is the measuring and reporting results section. We've already kind of touched on this. This year, we aren't filling out year 2 outcomes. Everything else gets filled in. When we're talking about the purpose of the metrics is to identify progress towards the goal, to measure the impact of the actions within the goal, and to determine the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of those actions. In terms of the instructions for the metric, we're going to identify within that metric, we're going to identify the standard of measure that's being used to determine progress towards the goal or to measure the effectiveness or one of the more actions associated with the goal. So this has to be something that is measurable. It is a measure of progress. LEAs must identify metrics for specific student groups as appropriate, including expected outcomes that address and reduce disparities in opportunities and outcomes between student groups. That's especially true when we're talking about like the equity multiplier goal, or when we're talking about actions that are addressing those student groups that are performing within the red. Metrics can be qualitative or quantitative, either works, but at a minimum, you have to include all of the applicable metrics related to the state priorities, those state required metrics that I spoke about a moment ago. If the state priority doesn't specify a metric, so for example, implementation of statewide standards in priority 2, there's no particular metric that's described as part of that. Or priority 3 with parent and family engagement, there's no metrics that are specified within the law around how that progress must be measured. The LEA can identify one or more measures of progress based on whatever data they want to use. There has to be a measure of progress related to those priorities within the plan. But what that measure of progress is, or how many measures of progress there are, is at the discretion of the LEA. Now, again, we encourage LEAs to use metrics that are based on or reported through the relevant local indicator self-reflection tools within the dashboard. We talked about that this past Tuesday at our webinar on the local indicators. But those local indicators have to be based on local data. if that local data can then be used to also inform metrics within the LCAP, you kill two birds with one stone, and again, streamline the process, reduce that duplication of effort. That's something that is a positive. So required metrics for LEA-wide actions. This is where we get into a little bit of the increased or improved service requirement. For each action that's identified as contributing towards the requirement to increase or improve services for foster youth, English learners, and low-income students, and is being provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis, the LEA has to identify one or more metrics to monitor the effectiveness of the actions. Those required metrics have to be identified within either the action description or more commonly within that third column in the increased or improved services section of that first prompt. And those metrics have to be included within the LCAP. We can't just identify, oh, we're going to measure we're going to measure progress for this LEA-wide contributing action by using this local benchmark assessment, but then the local benchmark assessment isn't included as a metric within the LCAP. Those metrics that are called out as being for LEA-wide contributing actions needs to be included within the LCAP. So that it's clear both to the LEA and their educational partners about how progress is being monitored for those particular actions. When we're talking about required metrics for equity multiplier goals, again, there have to be specific metrics for each of the identified student groups, those student groups that are performing in the red based on the 2024 dashboard. Those have to be included in the plan, and there can also be specific metrics that are related to credentialing, subject matter preparation, and educator retention at those equity multiplier schools, which is the other area of focus within the equity multiplier. In terms of the baseline should remain unchanged from the 2024-25 LCAP. It's intended to be that standard of measure. And so it stays the same. It doesn't change from one year to the next. It's that point in time that everything else within the 3-year cycle is measured off of. In general, the target from year 3 outcome is also going to remain the same. You're not going to try to hit a moving target. So in general, the target for year 3 outcome is going to remain the same. There are instances when you might want to change the target for year 3 outcome. If you've met that outcome and you want to continue implementing the goal, you could bump that outcome out. But again, if it's part of a focus goal, meeting that year 3 outcome is actually showing that you're in part fulfilling, or you're actually meeting that goal, which is the, ideally we want to meet our goals and not just keep kicking the goal down the road. Specifically for charter schools, if a charter school has developed a 1 or 2 year LCAP, they can identify their target as being for year 1 or a target from year 2, as is applicable to the charter school. The charter schools don't have to identify an outcome that's 3 years down the line. You just change that. When we're talking about current different from baseline, when we're completing the 2025-26 and 26-27 LCAPs, you're going to enter that current different from baseline and look at the difference that has been made. Again, with charter schools, that current different from baseline is basically going to look at either the difference from year one, or if they have like a 2-year budget cycle, they can identify the difference from year two, but it does not have to be the difference across all 3 years. So here's an example for this year of what this might look like. Our metric is the percentage of correct responses on the interim district common assessment in math, reported by student groups. We've got our baseline that are there for 4 different student groups. We are putting in our year one outcome for this particular year. And so you can see how student groups are performing against the baseline. We also have our current different from baseline filled in. And again, you can see the change that has occurred between the year one outcome and the baseline within that current different from baseline column. And of course, we've got our target for year 3 outcome, which is unchanged. And so this is kind of the way that this will look during the as part of the 2025-26 LCAP. Again, the goal analysis occurs next within the plan, but as we've already talked about, we did that earlier back on December 5th. If you're interested in that, you can look back at that webinar and get information specific to the goal analysis. Suffice to say, you're reflecting on the implementation of the goal from the prior year, and you're going to identify any changes that have been made to the goal and the actions here for the 2025-26 LCAP. There is no standalone annual update, which I think I've said probably 12 times on the various webinars, but it's all done within that goal analysis section. And then that gets us into the actions portion of the template. Within the actions, as we've talked about, we've got our short title, our description, our total funds, and our identifying whether or not the action is contributing towards increased or improved services. That short title of the action really should be a short title. You know, we want to keep it brief and to the point, something that allows us basically to connect the action description that's provided here to the action, to the funding details for the action that are provided within the action table. Then the description, which is going to be probably a little bit more in depth, hopefully more in depth, but not too far in depth. Basically, we want that description to provide a description for folks that are reading it of what's being done with this action. And remember that that description should in some way relate back to what the goal is trying to do. Unless we're talking about a maintenance of progress goal, in which case the action is more related to the ongoing implementation of a particular process or something like that. Now, actions that are contributing to increased or improved services can also use the action description to include that explanation of how the actions are principally directed towards and effective in meeting the LEA's goals for its unduplicated students. But that's optional. If you don't do it here, you have to do that down in the increased or improved services section. Just some LEAs find that it's easier to provide that on an action, that description on an action by action basis within the action description, as opposed to providing it in the within the increased or improved services section. We can also, this description can also include identification of one or more specific metrics to measure the effectiveness of actions that are being provided on an LEA-wide basis. So again, you know, going back to those contributing LEA-wide actions and identifying the metrics that are there for them, you could provide that description here as well. In terms of total funds, you're going to enter the total funding that's associated with that action from all four of the funding sources that are identified within the LCAP. Remember that within the LCAP, funds are identified as either LCFF funds, other state funds, local funds, or federal funds. There's four categories. That's it. There's no specific requirement to include specific object or resource codes for funding within the LCAP, with the exception of actions that are using LREBG, Learning Recovery and Emergency Block Grant funding. But we'll talk about those specifically and provide some examples at our webinar on January 14th. So let's talk really briefly here about required actions. There are four types of required actions within the LCAP. The first type of required action is specific to English learners or long-term English learners, so ELs and LTELs. Basically, LEAs that have 30 or more English learners and or 15 or more LTELs have to include specific actions in the LCAP. Those actions have to be related to, at a minimum, language acquisition programs and professional development for the teachers that are providing the instruction to them. Our recommendation is that folks look at their English, the needs of their English learners and the needs of their long-term English learners, and really determine whether or not those needs are the same. Because sometimes you can address the needs of your English learners and your long-term English learners using the same action. Other times you can't. Sometimes the needs of your English learners are going to be different than the needs of your long-term English learners. In fact, probably more often than not, they're going to be different. And if they're different, then you want to have separate actions for your LTELs and your ELs if you've got 30 or more English learners and 15 or more LTELs. So if you've got 15 LTELs, you want to have specific actions for them, and then additional actions that are specifically for your English learners. And again, those actions at a minimum have to focus on language acquisition programs and PD, but you can go beyond that. If you want to have additional actions that go into additional areas, you can certainly do that. And based upon dashboard performance, you might want to consider doing that based on what specific indicators those student groups show up as being in the red on. Second type of required action is required actions for technical assistance. And so for most LEAs, this is going to be what's commonly referred to as differentiated assistance. LEAs that are eligible for differentiated assistance have to include actions in the LCAP that are related to the specific work that's underway as part of receiving that technical assistance. That's also going to tie in with the description of technical assistance in the plan summary, and is going to provide that alignment between what the LEA is working on as part of its differentiated assistance process and the goals that it's trying to achieve. So there should be some alignment that's there. This also includes LEAs that have requested technical assistance from their county office of education, or school districts or county offices that don't have an approvable LCAP by October 8th. Those are other instances, but those are less common than LEAs being eligible for differentiated assistance. The third type of specific action is specific actions for student groups that were lowest performing based on the 2023 dashboard. And again, the reason that I use the phrase lowest performing is because on the 2023 dashboard, the college and career indicator did not have a color. It had the purple cell phone bars, And so lowest performing was the single cell phone bar. Um, all the other state indicators, it was the red indicator. Now, these required actions were required to be in place in the 24-25 LCAP. They continue to be implemented. They are not required to be changed based on the 2024 dashboard. They stay the same in general. That doesn't mean that you can't make adjustments to them. Um, they have to remain effective. So basically, you have to address the student groups and the indicators that were lowest performing within a school within the LEA, with a student group within the LEA, or a student group within any school within the LEA, based on the 2023 dashboard. But that doesn't mean that you can't make adjustments to those actions if you determine that there's some changes that are needed to those actions in order to help improve the outcomes of students. You're just not going to change the student groups that they're focusing on, or the indicators that they're focusing on, or the schools that they're focusing on. That's going to remain consistent throughout the remainder of the 3-year cycle. And then the new addition, this new piece that we have this year, are specific actions for unexpended learning recovery and emergency block grant funds. If the LEA has unexpended LREBG funds, those have to be included within the LCAP, and the actions that are supported by LREBG funds have to have some additional information as part of the action description. The action description has to identify the action as an LREBG action. It has to include an explanation of how research supports the selected action. It has to identify the metrics being used to monitor the impact of the action, and it has to identify the amount of LREBG funds being used to support the action. And again, this is something that we're going to go into more detail with on our January 14th webinar. We're actually going to throw up some examples of what this might look like as part of the action descriptions. And so tune into that webinar in order to get more information and some examples of what this will look like within the plan. As I've touched on before, we've got all these requirements. It's entirely possible for one action to meet multiple requirements. So you could have an action within the LCAP that meets all of these requirements. It could be an action related to technical assistance because you're eligible for DA based on the performance of ELs. It could be an action that's required for English learners because the LEA has 30 or more English learners. It could be an action for student groups performing in the red on the 2023 dashboard because the ELs were there. It could be an action that's required as part of an equity multiplier focus goal because the LEA's EL student group at the equity multiplier school was performing in the red. And then it could be an action that's required for LREBG because the needs assessment that was done showed that ELs were one of the student groups that needed additional assistance. And so you're supporting those students with the LREBG funds. So you could have one action that meets all of these criteria, that checks off all of these boxes within the LCAP. And so, I think a lot of LEAs, tried to do that last year, make sure that those things were kind of lining up and doing double duty. But don't forget that's something that can be done within the plan. Really quickly, touching on the action tables. The action tables are where the funding shows up within the LCAP. If you're using an electronic template system, you're going to fill this out as part of the action information. And it's just going to plug in the information into these various tables and be produced as part of the PDF. If you are looking to use the Excel version that's posted on the CDE's website, you type all of the information in, or the vast majority of the information in, on the total planned expenditures table. Once it's there, it populates into the other sheets on the tables, but you can look at the instructions and it provides you with some additional information there. If you do need additional assistance with that, shoot us an email and we'll be happy to walk you through that and help you out. There are 5 action tables that are part of this, the LCAP and the requirement. You've got the total planned expenditures table, the contributing actions table, the annual update table, contributing actions annual update table, and the LCFF carryover table. And we talked about the annual update table, the contributing actions annual update table, and the LCFF carryover table as part of the goal analysis webinar. We'll talk more about the contributing actions table as part of the increased or improved services webinar. Just a quick reminder here, when we're talking about the alignment of contributing actions, when you're filling out your goals and actions section, please make sure that you're referring back to the action tables to ensure that the totals align with what's in the goals and actions, but then also within the budget overview for parents, that the amounts align in terms of how much funding is being included within the LCAP, how much of that is for what within the budget overview for parents is referred to as high need students. That's your unduplicated students, low-income English learner and foster youth, and making sure that those amounts align, more because that provides that helps build trust with your educational partners. If they look at those things and they see that the total amounts for each of the actions is different in the action tables than it is in the action descriptions, it's obviously going to raise some flags. Similarly, if the total amount of funds that's being provided within the LCAP is different in the budget overview for parents than it is in the action tables, it's going to raise some flags. And so make sure that those are aligning as you're going through this. And so I know that we're over time. I appreciate those of you that have stuck with us this far. Just remember that all of the goals, all of the components within the goals are interrelated. They help tell the story of each particular goal and what the LEA is seeking to achieve there. Ensure that the unit of measure is consistent across each of the metrics. So if we're using a percentage as part of our metric, that our year 1 outcome, our year 2 outcome, that there are percentages as well. We don't want to switch things up and go from a percentage in one year to a number in another year, because then we don't really have any idea of how whether or not progress was made. And of course, if you did that, you wouldn't really be able to fill in the difference from baseline either, since that number would not correlate to a percentage or vice versa. Each metric should contribute to data that measures progress towards the goal. We don't just want random things that are put in as measures of progress that have nothing to do with the goal or that have nothing to do with evaluating effectiveness. You want to make sure that those metrics that are in there are meaningful to the goal. And each action needs to contribute towards the goal as well, in terms of what it's seeking to do. You don't want actions that are in a particular goal, unless it's a maintenance of progress goal, that are unrelated to what that goal is seeking to achieve. And then also you ensure that your learnings from the mid-year update inform the goals moving forward. As part of that goal analysis and looking at any changes that need to be made, how has the information gained through the mid-year update helped you to be able to evaluate the need for changes? And then lastly, when we're writing this LCAP, it's really easy to start letting the words flow, and it's difficult sometimes to shut them off. So, providing your community with clear and concise descriptions of what's being done is going to go a long way towards not only shortening the plan length, but really helping to communicate to your educational partners. Again, one of my favorite quotes is Einstein's, "If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough," quote. So, keep that in mind. As always, we've got our upcoming webinars. We've already talked about those. We've got some resources if you need them at the end of the presentation. And you have our contact information as always. Other than that, thank you for being here with us. We appreciate your time. We appreciate everything you all do for your LEAs and the students that you serve. And we wish you a good afternoon. Sorry that we went over a little bit, but it's a really dense topic. So thanks and have a lovely afternoon.